when I recovered from my surprise after reading that letter, it took me not quite 10 minutes to make up my mind as to what I would like to do. So we packed up my things and uh, accepted at once, and I started out. I decided not to take a railroad uh, trip across the country, but rather to take a bus, because first of all it was much less expensive, and I thought I would see the country much better. So I took a bus to Chicago and changed and took it was a long bus trip, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was such a wonderful chance to see the land, see the farms all across the United States, and drive through the little towns. And finally, when I landed at Henry Street, it was one of the most wonderful experiences, because I learned what a tremendous organization it was. It had been founded in about 1890 by Lillian D. Wald, who was the daughter of a very prominent Jewish family in New York. She had studied nursing and decided that how she wanted to spend her life was to dedicate her all of her strength to helping the Jewish immigrants who were piling up into the slums and tenement houses in Lower East Side of New York, and needed all kinds of services to help them recover and establish themselves in this country. So she gathered together a very prominent and very enthusiastic group of her friends in New York, and they founded the Settlement Association. And she started, first of all, one of the first activities of the settlement was to provide a free nursing service for all those who needed it. The settlement would train the nurses not only in the practice of nursing, but especially in the kind of service which people in tenement houses needed, and how to teach people to accommodate themselves to this country and to the needs of their children. These people had come mostly from very poor sections of Russia and Poland and Lithuania, and had very little background in health care and so on. So the nursing service burgeoned as it spread its possibilities to other areas of the settlement, of the poor sections of New York. And early on, after the First World War, it was necessary for them to set up a business office on Fourth Avenue away from the settlement, so that it no longer had its main organization at the settlement, but we had visiting nurses who lived in the residence of the settlement, and had an office in the settlement for service to that particular neighborhood. Then all through New York there were agencies, especially offices in the settlement houses, which were being set up all through New York City. And that was one of the main directions of the settlement program. Another was the Workers' Education Center, where the men in the neighborhood, especially the men, could come in and get special education to help them improve their lives, in their understanding of the kind of industries that they were going into, and how to improve their lives and their working chances. The settlement had also formed a dramatic department, and it had been given a very beautiful and commodious playhouse over on East Broadway, about a block from 265 Henry Street, which was the main office. And there was a pottery studio and an art department and a wonderful music school just around the corner from the playhouse, so that they could take they would take young, very accomplished musicians who needed a steady job. Music, as even as now, was a sometime thing for many professional musicians. Sometimes they would have an opportunity to work, and sometimes they didn't. And so the settlement established the music school for making it possible for these young musicians to be able to teach. And especially because the interest of the Jewish families was very strong in having their children learn music, and their children were talented and encouraged at home to work. There were many accomplished musicians who had gotten their start at the Henry Street Music School. Then there was the largest section of the settlement, of course, was for accommodating the children who would come in for recreational activities after school. And we had a very lively program for all ages of children, and that included as strongly organized groups with clubs of children, so that they would come in with a group of friends who wanted to have a club, and we would get the best possible volunteer leaders for those clubs to give the children the experience of understanding New York, going out to museums and to wonderful recreation places, and also to work out their club programs with as rich a program as possible. And that was my particular interest in the settlement. And there was a fine staff of people working with boys and older boys and girls together, and with children. And we had a play school in the summertime, which was all day, every day in the summer, for younger children. And that summer was an eye-opener to me, because Saturdays and Sundays I usually had free, and some of the friends from the settlement house and I would go exploring. We got bicycles and would ride all over New York. We could park our bicycles without any difficulty at museums, anywhere, and anywhere that we wanted to go. And the possibilities, of course, were endless for adventures and exploration into other neighborhoods. There was an Italian neighborhood over on the other side of 7th Avenue, near the Pennsylvania Station at 33rd Street, Hudson Guild. There were other Italian settlements. There were several other Jewish settlements in the Lower East Side, and there were German settlements up in the German section of in the upper East Side, and it was like many different countries that you could explore, and there were never-ending things to enjoy. And then, of course, there were theater and concert performances that we could get to. The settlement program at that time, the pattern of a settlement house was to bring people of many different interests and talents as residents into the neighborhood, and for them the privilege of living at the settlement house was that they contributed 2 days a week, 2 nights a week after their jobs in some part of the program. So we had, I should think, perhaps 30 different people living in the settlement house. Wonderful collection of people of all different interests. The head of the BBC, for instance, in New York, came down and lived at Henry Street, and his part of the program was to start a credit union. Then we had 2 members of Margaret Webster's Shakespeare company who came down and lived at the settlement, and they started drama groups in the playhouse. And one of the ideas that they had of the kind of drama group they would like to do with settlement children was to dramatize the problems they had somewhat in the pattern of the living newspapers, which were being shown on Broadway. Then there were very active groups. This was the middle of the Depression in the 1930s, and the, one of the great contributions of the theater in New York was to dramatize the kinds of things which people were suffering, what they thought, what they felt, and how they felt their lives could be improved. So we had living newspapers of all sorts. One of the big problems for young people in the settlement was if they wanted to buy a suit of clothes, for instance, and had only $5, they would have to borrow $20 more from somewhere, and the loan sharks who operated throughout the poor neighborhoods in New York would be very glad to loan them $20 if they paid $5 a week interest ad infinitum. And if they couldn't get $20 together to repay the loan, they sometimes would build up a debt of $75 on a $20 loan. So the young men in the neighborhood who were particularly troubled by the loan sharks wrote, with the help of our drama residents, wrote a wonderful living newspaper dramatizing their experiences with the loan shark. And while they were practicing in the playhouse one night, one of the worst of the loan sharks came by and asked to be let in, and the people who were taking care of the door knew him, recognized him, and were afraid that he might try to beat up the people who were providing the program, just as he did the people who couldn't pay their debts to the loan sharks. The violence that was perpetrated by loan sharks was in all of the neighborhoods a big problem. Some of the youngsters were so afraid of their loan sharks that they would escape and go to Florida or go off to some other place, hoping that they wouldn't get beaten up. And the coaches of the group that were doing the program on the stage were overcome with anxiety when they saw this head loan shark come marching into the playhouse, and so they shivered and shook. But one of the coaches came out and said, "Well, it's wonderful you're here. Come on up and tell us exactly how this should be done." And the loan shark said, "You're not doing it. You're not playing this the way it should be done at all. Now, if he gets in there, he should say it this way." And so they said, "All right, well, you show him how." So the loan shark demonstrated what he should say, and what kind of a threat should he get. Well, this is the kind of threat that would be active. So we got him in as the part of the whole play. Of course, the neighborhood was electrocuted when they heard that this loan shark was going to be in the play, so that there were long lines of people waiting to come in, and we had an absolutely hilarious time with the loan shark playing himself in this play, which was to demonstrate how on earth could we get rid of loan sharks in the neighborhood. Well, that was one of the wonderful experiences. They had other kinds of drama that they worked on, and it answered a good many of the questions in the neighborhood, and of course kept the neighbors very close to it. We used to do a great deal of home visiting, because when I had a group from which some of the children were missing, I would go over and visit the parents and see what was happening. Almost all of the children who came to the settlement lived on the top floor. That was the 5th floor of a walk-up apartment house. Some old style, the railroad style apartment buildings, the tenement houses, and some were were had a central areaway in the middle of the apartments were built around. Some of the apartments had had one toilet in that areaway in the center of where four apartments would be on one floor, and of course the living conditions were very hard. The crowding in the settlement neighborhood wasn't quite as great as it had been earlier on in the 90s. In the early part of the century, there often were 2 or 3 families crowded together in one tiny apartment with these miserable plumbing arrangements, and very difficult life for them. But they had been improved somewhat by the 1930s, but not very much. So that the experience of getting into the families. Do you want to turn it off? It was always very heartwarming to go and visit the families of our children, because you climb up 5 floors in the old lion tenement houses and knock on the door of the family, not knowing what kind of response they might have, and somebody from inside would say, "Who's there?" And I'd say, "I'm from Henry Street Settlement." Immediately they came to the door and said, "Come on in," because the settlement meant so much to them. They trusted the people in the settlement because they knew them, and they knew that the settlement people were on their side. And that was particularly true in the elections. I started at Henry Street in 1935, and in 1936 we had elections in November, and at that time there were no voting machines, and the 2 dominant political parties in New York were the Republicans and the Tammany Hall Democrats, and one was just about as corrupt as the other. And when the election was set up in the small room in someplace in the neighborhood, in all of the election precincts, the Tammany Hall people would be sitting on one side and the Republicans on the other side, and each of them would try to grab anybody who came in to vote and say, "I'll help you with with your vote." And the people would sit down and try to figure out who was going to do the best thing for them. There was no way that they could disguise their votes until after the voting machines were put in. And at that time, the settlement put a voting machine in the first floor and invited all the neighbors to come in and demonstrate. We demonstrated to them then how the voting machine worked. They went in, pulled the curtain behind them, and the machine was set up so that they could vote absolutely privately. Always before, they had been persuaded by the corrupt political party representatives to vote one way or another by getting maybe $2 for their votes. The Democrats usually paid $2, and the Republicans then would pay $3. And when the voting machines were put in, we all, the residents in the settlement house, there were about 30 of us who lived in the 2 buildings that belonged to the settlement. We would go in and stand by as people walked in to go into to pull the curtain behind them to go into by the machine. One of the precinct politicians would say, "That's all right. We'll show them. You don't need to bother. You girls can go on back to the settlement house, and we'll show them how to vote." And we'd say, "It's perfectly all right. We don't mind at all." And we'd say, "We just stand outside and let the people pull the curtain behind them," because they knew from the advice that they got from the settlement that nobody but nobody could tell how they voted. If they, we had shown them how to pull the trigger and on the candidates that they wanted to choose, and no one could. So they were delighted because then they could sell their votes both to the Republicans and the Democrats, and nobody would be able to know the difference. So that was the beginning of the control over Tammany Hall, which had dominated New York politics for so many years. And at that time, in 1935, when I first went to Henry Street, and on until, I think, for about 5 years, Fiorello LaGuardia, who was a master politician, was the mayor. And coming into New York with under the mayoralty of LaGuardia from Chicago, which had a very corrupt political system, was like going out into the sunshine from a dark room, because LaGuardia was such a wonderful mayor. He had a common touch which was touched everybody. He would have political discussions on the radio. There was no television then, of course, and there would be radio programs which people listened to very with great interest, because he always made them interested, and he brought the political difficulties of the city down to their own experiences, and they could see what kinds of problems the city had to solve. At one point, I think in about 1937, there was a big newspaper strike, and the newspapers, none of the newspapers were published for many, many days. So LaGuardia went on the radio, and he said the children don't need to be deprived of the comic strip just because the papers aren't coming out. So he would come on in the early evening hours and read the comic strips to the New York children. And of course, he was such a wonderful person that he won everybody over. He often came to dinner at the Settlement House, because Henry Street was, under Miss Hall's guidance, was a very strong supporter of his administration, and he would come down and speak to people in the neighborhood and to the residents. We often had residents' meetings to bring us up to date on what was going on in the city and what kinds of problems which were reflected in the neighborhood were also common in other parts of the city, and what the administration was trying to do. And LaGuardia was about 5 feet 1 inch tall, I think, just a little bit of a down-to-earth man, and just as humorous as he could be. He was a man of great talent and absolute integrity, and deeply loved. He was missed terribly after he left the administration, and New York politics has never been quite as clean since then. But the settlement was always involved, not only in local politics, but also in national politics, along with all of the settlements which belonged to the National Federation of Settlements. There were 225 settlements all over the United States by that time, in every large city, and chiefly located in the immigrant neighborhoods in each of those cities, where people had flowed in from Europe and from Asia, but chiefly from Europe, during the late decade of the 90s, and the 90s, 1890 and on up until late in the 1920s. There were still many immigrant people coming in, and they needed help in getting adjusted to the neighborhood, and especially it was hard for parents who didn't speak English to have their children in English language schools and not be able to communicate very well with them. And the settlement staff always sought to be an interpreter to the schools or to any other agency of the people in the neighborhood, because that was the whole purpose of living in the neighborhood, that we would see the problems that our neighbors faced firsthand, and by having their confidence, we could help them to express what they needed to be represented when they needed to be at the City Hall or in Congress. And when social legislation was being proposed in Congress, Miss Hall and her husband, Paul Kellogg, who was editor of Survey magazine, were very active in helping the settlements gather information from their neighbors about all kinds of social problems. For instance, there was an attempt to control the price of milk because dairies were having difficulty, they thought, in supplying milk at the price they could get. And the settlements gathered information from their constituents, from the people in the neighborhoods, what it means to a family if the price of milk goes up 2 or 3 cents a quart, that they won't get as much milk, and that's harder on the children. And because Henry Street had always been very active in health care, they also were active in promoting healthy possibilities for the neighborhood. And when there were bills in Congress relating to housing, employment, education, health care, all of the things which affected our neighbors most crucially, the settlement would send out word to the settlements across the country, talk to your neighbors, get me case studies, case stories of what it means in a family when the husband is out of work, or when they can't find a house that's an apartment that's affordable, or when they can't pay for a doctor. This was one of the most crucial questions. There was no health insurance at all, and although the city had some welfare health arrangements, they were not adequate for families who were on low incomes and didn't qualify for welfare. And Miss Hall then took all of these case studies, there were hundreds sent in to her, and with the help of her husband, put them together in testimony, which she then came down, and under the guidance of some of the senators and congressmen who were particularly involved in getting good social legislation enacted, she was asked to testify at hearings. And largely as a result of that very colorful and real and troubling material which the neighbors were able to, the settlements were able to collect from their neighbors about what it means to live in poverty and not be able to raise your families in the way that you want to. That was one of the principal purposes of the whole organization, and I was very much interested in the way in which that material was used. And when Lily Peck asked me to come on the staff of the National Federation of Settlements to work with all of the staff members in the settlements across the country who were working with young people, I was delighted because I felt that was a chance to get a little broader experience. So in 1938, I went on the staff of the National Federation of Settlements. That meant that there were 3 of us on the Federation staff. Our office was up at Christodora House on Tompkins Square in New York. And because Lily Peck lived at Henry Street Settlement, and Helen Hall was president of the National Federation of Settlement, Lily Peck was the national secretary of the Federation, I thought it wasn't a good idea for me to live at Henry Street Settlement anymore too. So I went into Greenwich Village and lived at Greenwich House, which was another very strong settlement under the leadership of Mary Simkovich, who was one of the great leaders in achieving legislation making public housing possible, low-income public housing available for people in the settlement people in neighborhoods anywhere. And living in Greenwich Village was an entirely different kind of experience because that was an Italian neighborhood. We didn't have quite as large a settlement residency then. There were probably 10 women and maybe 6 or 8 men who were living at the settlement. But at that time, Greenwich Village was a largely Italian neighborhood. And one of our great friends on the staff of the settlement was the man who did all of the repairs and keeping the settlement working. His name was Tony. And one day, some of us in the residence tried to persuade Tony to cook us an Italian dinner on Sunday night because we had all of our meals together during the week, except on Sunday night when the staff had the day off. And Tony was delighted to do it. And he said, somebody has to help me. So I went around with him in Greenwich Village to buy the food for the dinner for the staff. And he went into the butcher shop and said they're going to have cooked spaghetti for 20 people. And the butcher brought out about half a cow. And Tony said, no, not Italianos, these are Americanos. So the man took the huge piece of meat back into the freezer and brought out just a small hunk of meat, cut it all up, and Tony began needling him about Mussolini, saying things against Mussolini. And the butcher said, if you do this, I'll put you right in here with the rest of the spaghetti meat. And flew into a fury against Tony. But we had a wonderful time then, cook all day long it took to cook the spaghetti. And all that time, Tony regaled me with Italian operas. He knew them all by heart, not just the tenor parts, but all the parts. So he would go through, he would start the cooking of the spaghetti, and then he'd go through one opera after another, not just one part, but doing the whole thing, dramatizing it, singing it, going through it. It was the most wonderful day of spaghetti cooking I ever had. And of course, it was delicious, as you would expect. But it took one whole day to get the groceries necessary for that many people, and then the next whole day to cook it.
What year was this?
This was about 1938, 39.
On Morton Street.
I was living at Greenwich House then. And then in about 1940 or 41, one of the young staff members from Goodrich House in Cleveland, I knew staff members all across the country, so that when this young musician came to live in New York, she came to see me first to see where she might get a place to live, and I liked her very much. She was a very, very fine musician. She graduated from the University of Indiana and had a beautiful alto voice, and was going to come into New York to study with Lotta Lehman. That was Nell Shelke. And while she was studying at University of Indiana, she had fallen in love with one of her professors, Bob Tangeman, and they decided they would get married. But he couldn't leave Indiana. She didn't want to go back to Indiana because she wanted to keep on studying with people in New York. So I decided that we might find ourselves an apartment and live together. Would be another experience than living in the settlement and having everything done for us. So we looked and looked and looked. She had a little income because she was the soprano soloist for the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. I mean, she was an alto soloist. And she could afford about $25 a month a rent, and so our limit was $50 a month rent. And we looked at, I suppose, 75 different apartments in New York, one after the other. And that was the time when my sister Eileen, the story about the girls who came in from the West to live in New York, was common, because those girls were getting an apartment in Greenwich Village too, and the Greenwich Village apartments were something. You often found that a perfectly respectable apartment had been divided up into 2 or 3 different sections, and they would rent them out then section by section. But some of them you'd have to go through somebody's bathroom to get into your apartment, and sometimes you'd have to go down through the basement and come up, or go through it was the weirdest combination of living arrangements. But we finally found a place at 54 Morton that appealed to us very much. It was right on the street. It was not very far from Greenwich House, and we had all the wonderful, lively life, the street life of the village around us, and still the apartment. We had a very nice living room, which had a little tiny bathroom carved out of what had been a closet on one side, and a little tiny kitchenette with the ice box on the bottom and the stove on top, and there was an oven on top of the stove, so that you had to stand on a chair to get to look into the oven. But it worked out beautifully. Then we had a little room that was kind of at the end of the hall for a bedroom. So we lived high, we thought, and the rent was only $47.50, so we could afford it, and we had lots of fun. Nellie knew a lot of the musicians in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and they would sometimes come down and visit. She met a lot of musicians, because she had a very promising young career developing, and was getting more and more chances to sing. She got very well acquainted with Leonard Bernstein, who was the conductor of the New York Philharmonic then. And it always surprised me when these musicians, you'd think they would be thankful forever to be employed by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra as violinists or violists. But there were so many of them were cynical about it, saying, well, yes, well, I mean, this is about the best you could do, of course. And it isn't very good, but it's all we could do. And lots of them were not happy musicians at all, which surprised me. But Nell and Bob Tangeman were married at the end of that year, and at the same time I decided that after 4 years at the National Federation of Settlements, I'd really like to get off and work in a settlement, just use all of the experience that had come to me, and in a settlement of my own. And a chance came to go up to Syracuse New York, where a very interesting group of women who had started not a settlement house but a working girls club in Syracuse during the First World War, wanted to adapt it to serve not just working girls but to be a real settlement house. So we started in 1942 with this wonderful board of directors to establish in the place of the working girls' home a real settlement. And part of that meant that we had to change the whole direction of the program at a time when there still was very little chance for racial intermingling. The children in Syracuse, although Syracuse had been on a station on the Underground Railway, which had helped slaves to get through to the north and find freedom before the Civil War, still there was a tremendous amount of feeling about any kind of racial mixture, and a reluctance on the part of organizations to let any black children come into the program. But the board of directors, very much influenced by friends, because some of them were friends of Helen Hall's of Henry Street, realized that interracial activity was the right direction to go. There was a Negro settlement not far from the Huntington Club, and also a Jewish center with whom we wanted to work. But because there were so many black children in our neighborhood, we wanted to have from the very beginning a program that would include anybody who wanted to come. But we didn't have very much space, so I went to the Plymouth Congregational Church, which was not very far from us, and asked the minister if it would be possible for us to have activities in the basement of the church at certain times after school and some evenings for the young people. And he took the matter up with his board of directors, but they decided that it wasn't a very good idea. They didn't want to have black children coming into the church, even though, now this was 1942, when we were already involved in World War II, which was to overcome racial discrimination. But people had, the feeling had not developed strongly enough. So we did everything we could to help people to understand that they didn't need to be afraid. And one of the great people who helped was Cleo Blackburn, who was head of the settlement, and a black settlement in Indianapolis. And he would come back occasionally and talk to our board of directors and to other members of the social work community in Syracuse. The first time he came, I went down to the Syracuse Hotel, which was the natural place to have him stay, and told him that we were having that I was from Huntington Club, which was the name of the settlement, and that had a very good name with all of the business people in Syracuse, because the members of our board were for the most part wives of the directors of most of the big industries and businesses in Syracuse. So I said we were having a very distinguished guest coming from Syracuse to stay. Oh yes, we'd be very glad to have you. So on, would just let me see what we have available. And I said, in passing, this was a time when you had to be very careful. I said in passing, he is the very much honored and distinguished director of a Negro settlement in Indianapolis. And the desk clerk at the hotel said, well, just a minute, I think I'd better check on the date. Now, what date did you say that was? And he went backstage and was gone for quite a while. And he came back and he said, well, I just remembered that we have a very busy time at that time, and I don't know whether we'll be able to put him up. And I said, but you said there would be room, and we would like very much to have him. And Miss So-and-so, who is the president of the board, wanted me to talk to the director of the hotel. If you'd like to have me speak to him, perhaps he would be able to find some place. And the desk clerk said, well, just a minute and let me see if he's available. And he went back, and when he found out that Miss So-and-so was likely to talk to him, he found that there was going to be a room available after all, but it was only on the first floor. And I said, would you like to tell me why? I realize that you've had some difficulty. Would you like to tell me why it's only on the first floor? And he said, well, you know how it is with guests. Guests, we have to accommodate guests, and they have all kinds of opinions. And some of them might take exception to riding to a higher floor in the elevator, so we would give him a room so that he would only have one floor to ride in the elevator. Now this was 1942, and it was the beginning of the pressure that it was possible to achieve because the recognition that we were fighting a world war on the basis of the Nazis' attitude toward racial discrimination, and yet practicing it in our own civilian life, gave people a clue about what change of heart was necessary and what whole change of progress was necessary. We then decided that it was important to have a Negro on our staff because we had many Negro children. We wanted to have an interracial staff as well, and found two very fine young black social workers who came on the staff as group leaders. And then at the time when we were fighting the most crucial kind of racial discrimination in California, when people were being put into camp, the Nisei, American citizens, many of them native-born American citizens, were all being rounded up, and even with Roosevelt's acquiescence, they were being put into camps. They had done nothing wrong. They had committed no crimes, but simply because we were at war with Japan, they were being rounded up and put into concentration camps. And we had associations with people in California who were trying to counter the disgrace of that action by getting out any young people that they could from the Nisei communities who were being put into those camps, and were able then finally to get the governor to agree to let college students, if colleges across the country would accept them as students, they could be released from their parents' the camps where they were, and could come. And we were able to get Syracuse University to take 19 Nisei students. And we had at that time, that was about 1943 or maybe early 44, we had at that time still a residence of working girls at Huntington Club. We hadn't yet been able to convert our program into a totally interdenominational and well, I'll go ahead. So this wonderful board of directors agreed that it was important for us to take one of the Japanese students. And I took it up with the girls in the dormitory and said that we would like very much, told them what a tragic mistake the government of the United States was making in treating its Japanese citizens this way, because they had done nothing wrong. It was just as if they would put everybody who was of German descent into prison because we were fighting Germany. And they understood that part, and it was possible to get most of the girls, there were about 20 who lived there, most of the girls could understand and feel how difficult life must be for all of those Nisei people, and they agreed that they would like to have one come and live in the dormitory with them. Now, it wasn't really a dormitory, everybody had their own rooms, except for two girls who hung held out against the idea, saying, "My brother is fighting those dreadful Japs, and I won't have anything to do with any of them. I won't stand it if you get Japs in here." And so we kept working on them and working on them. Day after day, they would have long sessions with each other, because the girls in the residence ate their meals together. They fixed their own meals and they ate their meals together, and they saw a good deal of each other. And one or two of them took the lead in trying to persuade the rest of them to see the light. But before those two girls had agreed to it, I got a telegram one day saying Kikuko Nakamura will be on the 10 o'clock flight from Los Angeles, getting into Syracuse at such and such a time on Sunday, which was the next day. So I called the girls together and told them that we had no choice. I wouldn't have forced the issue, except that was the girl was going to come anyway, and she would be there. And if they couldn't accommodate themselves to living in peace with a young girl their own age who'd had such a bad experience,